A systematic approach to zero trust. So zero trust obviously is a major topic, and lots of organizations are driving towards a zero trust model. Now, the challenge is that zero trust is not a single product. It's in fact not even a platform. Now, platforms can help drive that outcome and simplify, but it's certainly not the only answer. There's a lot of pieces to build out zero trust. And talking to many different people, you'll get very different answers of what zero trust means to them. Again, maybe based on perspective, but most likely many of them are right. It's just much broader than maybe what they're thinking. And so what we're going to do is move from the trust but verify model. So today when you plug into a network, you have access, you're trusted almost inherently. And then there'll be certain levels of verification throughout that interaction. What we're going to move to is fully never trust. So essentially the inside user becomes very much like the outside user, and we're going to constantly verify. And so to me, there is a level of trust that's established, but you're never fully trusted. And what I mean by that is that the asset, and when I say asset, I kind of combine that with user and device as an example. The asset, I'll never trust the payloads coming out of the asset, right? I'll always inspect that. There'll be never a level of trust that payload is safe. Same thing with a USB key that gets plugged in that might have a weaponized PDF. I'll never trust that USB key, and I'll always inspect. And so when you're going through this process and you start to fill in a lot of these holes that were there inherently based on trust but verify model, I'm a big believer that the adversary themselves will adopt and shift their current mechanisms to compromise environments, and they'll change their behavior. And so today, they don't have to do that. It's very much going back a decade where people would say, Windows is, not as secure as maybe Linux. And I always had the discussion point around maybe it actually is more secure. And my reasoning behind saying that before everyone jumps down my throat is that it's probably more tested than any other operating system out there. And in fact, vulnerabilities are being discovered at a rate that is higher than any other system because of its prevalence, right? It was the most widely used operating system, and therefore why build, attack or exploits against systems that didn't have the same level of presence. And so, in fact, it was tested more, and obviously Microsoft would address these patches, and inherently, as time went on, one could argue that it might be a more secured operating system. But as we start to fortify, as we can see here, the dam starts to, all the cracks and holes start to fill in. The adversary is going to shift, right, and find another way, another opportunity to get into the environment. So as you go through this process, this is taking a step back and looking at capabilities to drive towards a zero trust model. So it's not about product at this stage. It's really about capabilities. And the goal here is really to drive discussion, right? Thought around the approach. And so this will be focused on capabilities. And I've got a couple of workflows that we're going to go through. So one will be, and work from home obviously is a good one to start with, but the internet use case, right? And that could be, directly connecting to the internet. Obviously there's some risks there, as well as split tunneling. If you're have a VPN connection in and there's a split tunnel that goes on, obviously that split tunnel has an increased level of risk. You've got SaaS-based services that are available using native TLS. And then you've got VPN use case where you terminate on a VPN head end, regardless of where that exists. And obviously there's some inspection or some mechanisms that you're going to want to help drive out that zero trust outcome. Now, when you're going through this, don't look at these clouds as termination points. They're just an identifier of the flow that we're looking at. But we want to start thinking about what the adversary is looking to achieve. So, again, these are just high-level examples. You've got phishing, malware. We from our perspective, we want forensics. You've got system hygiene. You've got DDoS, direct internet access. That becomes a risk. Social engineering, DNS outages, split tunneling, credential theft, and it continues to go on and on and on. But the reason why you want to go through this a little bit, have a good understanding of where the threat vectors are, so as you build out the capabilities, you can identify where the gaps might be. And the goal would be, as you transition or start to go through this process, is to challenge it a little bit. And what you'll want to do is think about this as a red teamer, an adversary, an auditor, and really attack the outcome that you're trying to drive towards. Tear it apart a bit, right? Challenge the mechanisms or capabilities that you've introduced. And don't think of this from a budgetary perspective, a skill set shortage perspective. Remove all the barriers. What you want to do is drive an outcome of what you believe is required to secure that flow, and then drive towards that zero trust model. And so as we go through this, we also want to not only think about prevention capabilities, but also detect and respond capabilities, because nothing's going to provide you 100% security effectiveness, regardless of zero trust or not. Things are going to happen. And so detection and response becomes almost more important, not to diminish prevention, because we want to provide 100% prevention. The reality is it's impossible to do so in today's world. And so detection and response is going to help identify in the event that we do get compromised. And so when we look at it, we start, this is a work from home user, and then we'll get into the specific flows in a second. But we start looking at, things like system hygiene, right? How do we achieve that? How do we make sure that the patch levels are there? We start getting into exploit prevention and system process protection, right? And so we want to make sure that we protect critical Windows systems from being compromised through memory injection, and also other unpatched software that might have zero-day vulnerabilities associated to it. Again, a good prevention mechanism that we want to think about. EV and advanced malware, those are things that we certainly want on an endpoint. Malicious activity protection. So this is a mechanism that if, for whatever reason, we're able to get through all of these controls and something starts to happen, like the encryption of the drive, just based on that activity itself, can I stop that event from taking place and fully encrypting the drive? So looking for that malicious activity on the asset is tremendously valuable as well. And then obviously preventing that activity from going further. You got things like application blocking, network blocking from an L3, L4 perspective. You've got USB blocking, or potentially something that you want to do. Now, work from home might add some challenges there, because people might have to access storage devices and USB keys and things like that. But it's something that you want to identify and mitigate if you need to. You might need some IPS, firewall capabilities. Fileless really ties back into exploit prevention and system process protection, but it's memory-based attacks against the system itself. And I call it out specifically based on, fileless malware, just to ensure that, we haven't lost it, right? And then you finally get things like AI and machine learning. And so these are all capabilities that you're going to leverage to help mitigate risk, right? Or prevent the threat from being realized. And, it doesn't necessarily all have to be on the endpoint. There might be other areas that you do this. And I'm a big believer that prevention on the endpoint, although is necessary, is the worst place to do your prevention. And that's simply because if you're wrong, you're 100% compromised at that point. So then we move into things like detect and response capabilities. So endpoint detection and response becomes important, right? So if, for example, our controls, our capabilities fail from the prevention lens perspective, can I understand exactly what happened on the endpoint? So from, Jason's corporate asset launches Firefox under the identity JSON to a CNC server versus, JSON, corporate asset again. PowerShell under NT Authority subsystem made a connection to a CNC server. You're going to treat those events very differently. The first one might be as simple as Jason clicked on a link and got redirected to, an exploit kit server, CNC server, whatever. The other event, though, would highly suggest that there's a programmatic element to it, right? So there might be a script, a macro, or something that drove the launching of PowerShell and potentially a vulnerability within the system to run it under NT Authority subsystem to make the connection outbound. You got things like, how do I do a forensic snapshot, right? If you're working from home or at the coffee shop or whatever, how can I do that? Host isolation, again, if there is some risk here, can I mitigate that risk by isolating the host? You've got IOCs that are going to be fed to the system at all times. Cloud is obviously a good mechanism of driving some of those outcomes. Command line capture. So I want to know not only that PowerShell was launched with NT Authority subsystem, but I also want to know it was PowerCat minus, the entire CLI that was passed to that command line. So I have the full command line capture that was passed within PowerShell as an example. Sandbox and file analysis. So I put this as a detect and response capability, although a file can be submitted to a sandbox to be detonated, depending on the protocols being used, you're not going to be able to necessarily do that in real time. And so that's why I've done it as an after or detect and response capability versus prevention. Now, once you've detonated that payload and determined the behaviors suggest a disposition of malicious, then you have the ability to mitigate any future impact. But the technology also should go back in time and kind of give you an idea, at least for a certain period, whether or not the asset had seen this previously to it being known as malicious. Vulnerable software, so I want to be able to tie vulnerabilities to maybe any incidents that may have taken place, but also just identify vulnerabilities so I can address them, again, tying back into system hygiene and patching and address those. IP fix flow correlation, so this is where I take every single process and application and log every single connection made outbound from that asset. And so you might think, well, doesn't EDR provide some of that functionality? And it does, but typically it doesn't do every single application and process making an outbound connection or a connection on the network itself. And so this is just to make sure that we've got a complete ledger of everything that had happened. And so endpoint detection and response is certainly something that you need, but EDR is only as good as the agent, most likely, that's installed on the asset. And so there's gaps within your solution stack that you want to extend that EDR capabilities beyond the traditional endpoint with an agent on it. So you want to start transitioning to XDR and pulling a lot of more data points from the environment. As we start going on into the network a little bit, now we get into DNS layer security. You've got web proxy, you got DLP, you got TLS decryption, you got AV and advanced malware inspection. So you might say, well, wait a minute, you have that here and you have it here. Well, we all know layers are important, and so that's one reason. The other reason would be is that you cannot bank on 100% mitigation here. So we want to make sure that we're pushing the prevention capability as far away from the asset as we're protecting. So DNS certainly is a first line of defense, a great spot to block domains if they are determined malicious. And then if you proxy, you have the opportunity now to get into the payload a little bit and do additional inspection. And so AV and advanced malware capability certainly is something that you can do and should do. And so we get into more of that detect and response capability. And so we want things like DNS forensics, full URI capture. We want sandbox file analysis, again, based on this being, in this case, maybe an HTTP or HTTPS connection. You can't stop that real time and do a complete detonation of a payload in a sandbox and get a disposition back without losing the connection. And so now we transition, we get into, what service we might be accessing. Again, that cloud element is not a termination point. It's just an identifier of the flow itself. But as we transition into the service, we might have multi-factor authentication. We might want to do endpoint posture, geo control. So where you're connecting from, maybe I won't let you access it. Again, the disposition of your device, maybe I won't let you access the application itself. And then we get things like device insight, denied authentications, or things that we might want to track as well. Excuse me. And so when you look at this, you want to make sure that you're centralizing as much as these analytics pieces as possible. So it doesn't necessarily mean you need to build a data lake and push all the data there, but you need a mechanism to interrogate and pull that data and centralize it as you need it. And all these products have a certain level of that data on them already, so that you can certainly do that real-time analysis. But also you want to make sure you're simplifying. So if I, doing DNS recursion as an example, whether you're on or off premise, I want that all centralized to a spot where I can look at any recursion that may have taken place. And again, domains are going to be a big part of your forensics or incident response information that you're going to use to determine the entire scope of the breach and the impact to the organization. Same with URI capture, sandboxed files, flow analytics. All of that becomes very relevant during a breach. And so you don't want this all scattered in a bunch of different places. You want to know that you've got DNS recursion for all DNS queries in one spot. You've got all flow analytics in another spot. And ultimately have the tools to be able to interrogate that. And so you have one interface to work from. As we move along, we start getting into mail and things like, before the mail gets there, you want to make sure that the mail was going through reputation filtering. You've got spam, you've got business email compromise. Again, AV and advanced malware. We have an opportunity to do that as mail comes in. And this is a great place to do sandboxing because, and I'll talk about that in a second, but because we can hold mail for a period of time, so we can actually let the payload completely detonate in a sandboxed environment, get all the behavioral indicators, the disposition, and then ultimately either remove or quarantine that file or attachment in that mail, or maybe provide some mailbox auto remediation capabilities. You got gray mail, phishing, URL protection. Again, whether you defang or rewrite the actual link in the email itself, or you're using another mechanism because you've got some DNS or web proxy capabilities, you certainly want to have those layers in place. Sandboxing, as I mentioned, but remember the key here is that I've moved the sandboxing element into prevention here because I can do that here. I can actually sandbox the file and I have enough time to wait for disposition and prevent that attack from taking place if the disposition is malicious. DLP, so data loss prevention. And then we get into some of the mechanisms around detect and response. So message tracking is going to play a big role. You've got file analysis, that's part of the sandboxing element, right? So you might want to look at the registry entries, file activities, etc. that may have taken place during that detonation. And then the service itself, so the application on the server side, you might have, in this case, application segmentation. So the way, the ability to identify how the the application itself communicates on the network, and build in host-based controls. So you get into some of that micro and application segmentation. And then block communication based on any indicators that you may see, whether there's some type of MITRE attack that's taking place using some specific tactic and technique, or some IOC intelligence to suggest that the behavior is suspect, and you want to block that. Application visibility, obviously going to be a very key element to this, and then any forensics data that you can pull from this. And one would argue too, you would get into AV and advanced malware on the asset here as well, and probably some endpoint detection response capabilities as well. But again, this is not meant to go through and completely identify every single element. It's really meant to drive a discussion and build out those outcomes that you're driving towards. So we transition a little bit, and now we're at the VPN use case. And so this is going to be a little bit different. I might need different elements of control here, and both prevent and detect and respond, right? And so we'll keep the first piece that we've already done here, and we'll start adding some other elements. So DDoS becomes something that I may want in front of my VPN service to mitigate DDoS and taking down that service, especially now that service becomes highly critical for my work from home users, and to keep my business operational, but even learn from home, right? That is a big thing that's happening today as well. TLS decryption, again, this could be all ports, all protocols. The other one that we talked about previously was really around web-based protocols. But again, I would do it on web-based protocols here as well, because it's another opportunity for me to mitigate risk. And so if you're not doing TLS decryption, you're not doing IPS, right? You're not doing malware inspection. You've got to tear into that payload and look at it. Multi-factor authentication, endpoint posture, geo control. Again, these are mechanisms that you want to think about leveraging to add that second factor when they're VPNing into the organization. You got layer 7 firewalling, so we start getting into the next gen firewall capability, which may include IPS, advanced malware protection. But then you move into some other elements that I think are important. Behavioral based policy. So, having the ability to be able to identify multiple different factors to mitigate risk. And so, one of the things you could do is drive very strong correlation policies that might suggest that an IP address or a user, in fact, in the network is highly sensitive or highly critical, and therefore if there's certain things that happen, maybe a geo connection, a certain version of application as an example, and an IOC is triggered, maybe I want to put some prevention capabilities in place. Then you get web application firewall, mitigating any web-based services that you might be offering through the VPN itself. Then you come back to that detect and response capabilities, right? Denied or device insight, device or denied authentication is all going to be helpful. Host profiling, understanding the asset that you're preventing or protecting. This is key in order to drive out impact analysis. So if I don't know the operating system and applications that I'm protecting, how do I know when an adversary is attacking it what the impact level might be? So if I have a Linux-based attack that's targeting a Windows-based system, obviously I probably don't care, right? Especially if it was dropped in line. It's good to know and you want it logged, but it's definitely not something that's on the priority list. And so we've got to think of things like alert fatigue and empower our analysts, our defenders, with data that they can use that's meaningful to prevent or protect the business. And so impact analysis is going to provide me, here's an attack that's based or targeting a Windows-based system, and there's potentially vulnerability on that system, and that attack could be realized. That's tremendously valuable to me. You got sandboxing and file analysis. Again, that's moved back down into detect and response capabilities, again, because of the nature of the connection that's happening at this level here. Vulnerability insights going to be helpful. Flow analytics, event packet capture. So both of these become tremendously valuable. Flow analytics obviously can help show me deviations in communications. And if the more data I can stitch into that flow, like process and user that invoke the behavior, obviously the more helpful that is. And event packet capture is ensuring that if an IPS intrusion event takes place, that I have a packet capture of that activity, not having to go back and turn it on, but natively being able to capture that packet. Again, I trust nothing here, right? Even though I'm going to let access happen because there's a level of trust that takes place here based on all of the inspection capabilities that we've introduced, I don't trust it 100%. And that's why that payload all the time is constantly going to get inspected. That's why flow analytics is constantly going to be evaluated. Because if there's any deviation from that, any trust level that I've given that asset is going to change. Event flow, strong event workflows certainly going to be helpful as well. And then you have your service. So we won't go through this again, but we're using email as the example here. So again, another view, but we've added some capabilities from the first one. And then you've got SaaS. So, there's a strong drive towards leveraging native TLS and removing VPN in some use cases. And in many, you can completely remove VPN. And so we've got some other things to consider. And so that could include, MFA to the application, endpoint posture, geo control, right? We've already talked about those, so we won't go into depth there. But we also want to restrict non-sanctioned applications. So if, for example, you have a OneDrive as your sanctioned app, you probably don't want people going to Dropbox and Box and all these other different file repositories sharing potentially sensitive data with people, and you have no control. You're not backing up that data. Completely lose sight of it. So you want to make sure that you're restricting that application like Dropbox from users being able to access it, both on and off-prem, right? SaaS-based DLP. So again, you might want to introduce some DLP capabilities here. Device insight, denied authentications are certainly things to consider. And then you get, shadow IT. You want visibility into that and to help either sanction the application and have the right controls in place, or block the application itself. And then community trust insights going to help you make a decision whether or not this is an application that the community in general trusts, and then you can do your evaluation. But if they don't trust it, obviously that could allow you to make a decision to block that connection. And then you get into user entity behavioral analytics. For example, if I log in to Salesforce from the United States, and then shortly after I log in to Office 365 from the continent of Africa, that timeline, if it's 15, 20 minutes of 45, 3 hours, I cannot be in those two places. And they're both disparate cloud services, right, or SaaS-based services. And so how do I tie that together? And so I get alarmed or alerted and have the ability to mitigate against, there's something different here that's taken place, and it's impossible for that person to be in two places at once. In that short period of time. And then you have your service itself, and there's going to be certain levels of inspection and control that happen there. And obviously the detect and response capabilities are going to be important. So that's kind of the three core work from home use cases. But you get this kind of visual here of all the capabilities, and then you can start looking at it, going to manufacturers or vendors and partners and say, here's kind of the model I built out. Now I want to start building the zero trust model around this. And so what are some of the products? Because I feel like I am at zero trust based on what I have here. Now, what are the products that are going to help satisfy this, right? And so this is where the complexity can happen really, really quick, right? There's a lot of capabilities here. And so you want to simplify and find products that are going to help drive some of these outcomes. And so, but you can't just stop there. The other element that you've got to, highly consider is, how do I do threat hunting and incident response? So APIs is going to be your friend here. And so the goal is all these things that are happening do have the ability to interrogate and pull that data into a central location so I can, determine what may have happened. The other element is orchestration, automation, and playbook. We need to automate a lot of the activities that our analysts or defenders are doing. And so, as an example, one could be phishing, right? A fish comes in, maybe a user submits it as suspect. Can you look at the attachments, the attributes of the mail itself, and then run it through, an analytics engine that pulls all this data together, and then gives you, mitigating either through automation or manual process, creates a room or that your team can collaborate in and puts the team in it. Does it detonate the file because there was an attachment in it automatically and the report is already ready for you? These are things that you want to think about, that when you start building this out, the more fragmented and complicated it is, the harder it is for you to support some of these orchestration and automation capabilities. And then finally, you've got threat intelligence, whether through manufacturer, in-house, third party, whatever. You've got to ingest that threat intel and then systemically share that with the capabilities that you have, so you have more real-time prevention capabilities as these threats are being identified throughout the entire portfolio. So that's kind of the work from home view. I'm going to show you the campus user, and it's only a couple elements that we're going to change here, but the campus user, an asset connecting to an email-based services. So very similar things you're going to look for, right? But you might start thinking about segmentation. You might start thinking about lateral movement or lateral attacks, and more. But there's a lot of commonality between that user that's worked from home, as an example, or learned from home, that it is that when a user is plugged into the campus itself. And so I'm not going to go through each of these, but one of the additional elements that you would add, and this is a great example of that dialogue, because if you would have started here, this is where the team comes in and says, well, wait a minute, how did it get access to the network, right? Did we actually authenticate and authorize the asset itself? Are we using 802.1x? MAC authentication bypass. What did we do to allow it even to get access to the network? Because if zero trust is in play, we don't trust it to get access on the network. And so that would be an element that you would add here. And then someone might say, well, wait a minute, wouldn't we want to understand the posture of the asset? And absolutely. And again, this is before it even connects to the network. And so you might see this piece here that says endpoint. And so you might endpoint posture, and you might be saying, well, wait a minute, you're doing it here and here. Well, here I'm doing it from an application access perspective. I'm actually doing MFA and endpoint posture and geo control as you access the application itself, regardless of what NAC in this case would have done here from a network perspective, allowing it on the network. I don't care, because something may have changed from here to when it accesses the application. And so this is an opportunity for me to level set. So maybe you got on the network, but you're not going to access the application itself. And then you get into some dynamic control, micro-segmentation, or software-defined access on the campus side as well. And then denied authentications, obviously key. Device insight's going to provide you insight into what the device is that's connecting to the network. And then potentially adding vulnerability information into that, as well as, sticks and taxi information to see whether or not, it's a level of painful or greater. And therefore you can make decisions based on that information as well, to not allow it to have access to the network. So that's, again, just a summarized version of campus user to email service. And then again, you're going to go through this process about tying, your threat hunting, incident response, orchestration, automation, and threat intelligence. So that's going to be thought of in this process here as well. And so that's it. A systematic approach to zero trust. It's definitely a big, it's definitely a focus of many organizations. They're driving towards zero trust, but it's going to be a journey. And if you take a systematic approach to it, it's not just about capabilities and technologies, although that's a key element of it. It includes people and process as well, but this is a good way of kind of mapping out the capabilities to drive towards zero trust.